If someone told me my own family was quietly moving money out of my account every month, I would have never believed it until I saw the numbers myself. Eleanor Whitmore stared at her phone screen that late afternoon in her quiet suburban kitchen in Ohio, the sunlight coming through the blinds falling across the marble counter, making everything look normal in a way that suddenly felt unsettling. She had always been careful with her finances, the kind of person who checked her statements once a week and kept track of every expense down to the dollar. So when she noticed a small inconsistency in her account, she assumed it was a bank error. But the next month, the same thing happened again. A withdrawal she did not recognize. Same timing. Similar amount. Always around the beginning of the month. At first, she told herself it had to be coincidence. Maybe a subscription she had forgotten. Maybe an automatic payment she had set up years ago and never canceled. But something about the pattern made her uneasy in a way she could not ignore. Around the same time, her son-in-law Daniel Carter had moved into their home temporarily, saying it would help them save money as a family unit. Daniel was confident, always speaking about budgeting, investments, and efficiency like he had everything under control. He would sit at the dining table with a tablet, explaining how smart households optimized expenses. Her daughter Sarah Whitmore Carter often echoed his words without hesitation, saying things like, "Mom, we just need to be more careful with spending these days." It sounded reasonable on the surface, almost responsible, but something about the tone made Eleanor feel strangely distant in her own home. Then came the comment that shifted everything. One evening, as they were reviewing household expenses at the table, Sarah glanced at Eleanor's list of monthly costs and said softly, almost absent-mindedly, "Mom, you really do cost a lot to maintain the house." The words were not loud, not aggressive, but they landed in a way that made Eleanor pause mid-breath. Daniel did not correct her. In fact, he nodded slightly, as if it was a logical observation rather than a hurtful remark. That night, Eleanor could not sleep. She kept replaying the statement in her mind, not because of the words themselves, but because of how easily they were accepted. The next morning, she opened her banking app again and began going through every transaction line by line. That was when she saw it clearly. Every month, like clockwork, a transfer labeled under a vague description she did not recognize was leaving her account. The amounts were not massive, but they were consistent enough to accumulate over time. Her stomach tightened as she compared the dates. Every single withdrawal lined up with days when Daniel had access to her home office computer, the same computer she used for online banking when she was not on her phone. At first, she refused to jump to conclusions. Daniel was family. He lived under her roof. He ate at her table. He laughed during dinner conversations. But logic and instinct began to collide in a way she could not ignore. She started observing more carefully. Daniel often volunteered to help with small technical tasks, like updating passwords or organizing bills. He would offer to handle complicated online things, so she would not have to worry. At the time, it seemed helpful. Now it felt different. One afternoon, while Eleanor was folding laundry, she noticed Daniel casually using her home office again, saying he needed to check a document for work. Sarah trusted him completely, even bringing him coffee without question. But Eleanor quietly began writing things down. Dates, times, small inconsistencies. Not accusing anyone, not confronting, just observing. Days turned into weeks, and the pattern became undeniable. Every withdrawal aligned with Daniel's access. Every explanation felt thinner than the last. Still, Eleanor said nothing. Instead, she changed one small thing. She updated her banking security settings and added a secondary verification method that only she controlled, without telling anyone. She did it calmly, almost silently, as if adjusting a lock on a door that had been left slightly open for too long. Daniel never noticed. Life in the house continued as normal on the surface. Dinner conversations still happened. Sarah still believed everything was fine. Daniel still acted confident, still speaking about financial responsibility as if he were the one guiding the household. But Eleanor's awareness had shifted completely. She was no longer reacting. She was watching. And then came the second layer. One morning, while reviewing her credit alerts, she noticed something that made her pause longer than usual. There was an inquiry she did not recognize, something related to financial approval checks, subtle enough that it would be easy to overlook. It was not a transaction. It was something deeper, something that suggested planning rather than impulse. That was the moment Eleanor realized this was not just about small monthly withdrawals. There was a structure behind it. A system. Something being built quietly over time. She closed her laptop slowly, her expression unchanged, but her mind fully awake now. And in that silence, she made a decision. She would not confront anyone yet. She would not react emotionally. She would wait. Because now she understood something important. Whoever was behind this believed she was not paying attention. And that belief was exactly what she intended to use. But what Eleanor had not yet seen was the final layer forming in the background. The part that would turn everything she thought she understood upside down in a way she could never have prepared for. The realization that something larger was happening did not make Eleanor Whitmore panic. It made her quieter. Over the following days, she continued her routine as if nothing had changed. She made coffee every morning at exactly 6:45 a.m., watered the plants by the kitchen window, and asked her daughter Sarah Whitmore Carter about her day with the same calm tone she had always used. Daniel Carter, her son-in-law, still moved through the house with the same confidence, still speaking about budgets and efficiency as if he were the most financially responsible person in the household. But now, Eleanor was observing everything with a different kind of attention. She began noticing small behavioral patterns she had previously ignored. Daniel often positioned himself near her home office desk. Whenever she left the room, he would casually ask questions about account notifications or mention banking applications in conversation without any clear reason. He never acted suspicious on the surface, but there was a consistency to his interest that no longer felt random. One afternoon, Eleanor pretended to leave for a grocery run but quietly returned after 10 minutes, parking her car a short distance down the street. From outside, she watched through the front window as Daniel entered her home office. He stayed there longer than usual. When he finally came out, he did not appear nervous or rushed. He simply checked his phone, then walked into the kitchen as if nothing unusual had happened. That moment confirmed something she had been slowly accepting but not yet fully confronting. The issue was not just unauthorized withdrawals. It was access, control, and something about the way Daniel operated suggested planning rather than opportunity. That night, Eleanor reviewed every financial record she had access to. She created a physical notebook, writing down dates, times, and amounts by hand. She cross-referenced every entry with days Daniel had been alone in the house. The overlap was too precise to ignore. Still, she did not confront him. Instead, she began building quiet barriers. She changed her primary banking passwords again, this time adding multi-step verification and disabling any saved device permissions. She also contacted her bank and requested alerts for any login attempt from new locations. She did all of this without telling Sarah or Daniel. In parallel, she started testing reactions. One morning at breakfast, she casually mentioned that she might be updating her financial accounts for better security. Daniel looked up briefly, asked a single question about whether it would affect shared household payments, then returned to his meal without further concern. It was a subtle response, but Eleanor noted it carefully. He was not alarmed. He was not curious. He was calculating whether the system he had been interacting with was still accessible. A few days later, Eleanor noticed something new. A login attempt had been blocked by her bank's security system at 2:17 a.m. The location data was not precise, but it did not match her usual devices or household patterns. She stared at the notification longer than she expected to. There was no transaction that followed. Just an attempt. Quiet. Testing. As if someone was probing the edges of her financial access to see what would respond. That was when she realized the situation had evolved. This was no longer about repeated withdrawals that could be explained away as coincidence or error. This was now about persistence. Someone was trying to understand how far they could go without being noticed. Meanwhile, life in the household continued its carefully maintained normalcy. Sarah still believed everything was stable. She often repeated Daniel's talking points about budgeting and responsibility, reinforcing the idea that the household was becoming more financially disciplined. Daniel, for his part, continued to present himself as the one guiding that discipline. He would sometimes make small comments about reducing unnecessary expenses and streamlining costs, always framed as general advice, never directed at anyone specifically. But Eleanor began to notice a pattern in language as well as behavior. The idea of her being costly had been introduced once, then repeated indirectly in different forms. It was no longer just a comment. It was becoming a narrative. One evening, while Sarah and Daniel were watching television in the living room, Eleanor sat nearby with a notebook disguised as a recipe journal. She was not cooking. She was tracking. She recorded every small interaction, every financial comment, every moment Daniel had access to her devices or physical space. She also began quietly limiting that access further. She moved sensitive documents into a locked drawer, changed login credentials on devices he had previously used, and began using her phone exclusively for financial monitoring instead of the home computer. Daniel did not react to these changes immediately, but Eleanor noticed something subtle. He started asking more indirect questions, not about her finances directly, but about systems, about how people protect digital information, about what banks do when accounts are flagged for unusual activity. Each question sounded casual, but together they formed a pattern of increasing curiosity about the boundaries she was now reinforcing. Then came the second anomaly. A new inquiry appeared on her credit monitoring service. This time it was more serious than before. It suggested an attempt to evaluate borrowing capacity, as if someone had been assessing how much credit could be accessed under her identity. Eleanor felt a slow, controlled shift in her understanding. This was no longer about small, unauthorized withdrawals. This was about structure being built around her financial identity without her direct participation. She closed the notification and sat in silence for a long moment. From the living room, she could hear Daniel laughing softly at something on television, and Sarah responding with ease, completely unaware of what was forming underneath their everyday conversations. Eleanor did not interrupt them. She did not change her expression, but internally, something had fully settled. She now understood that the pattern she had been tracking was not the full picture. It was only the surface layer. And somewhere beyond that surface, a more deliberate plan was still unfolding, one that she had not yet fully uncovered, but was now close enough to see the shape of. By the time Eleanor Whitmore reached the point where she no longer doubted the pattern, she had already shifted into a different mindset entirely. It was no longer about confusion or suspicion. It was about structure, timing, and control. Every piece of information she collected over the past weeks had formed a silent map in her mind, connecting access, behavior, and opportunity. Daniel Carter still lived in her home, still shared meals with her daughter Sarah Whitmore Carter, still spoke with calm authority about household finances. But Eleanor now saw him differently. Not as family in the emotional sense that had once defined him, but as a variable in a system she needed to understand completely before acting. One morning, she decided to test something more direct without revealing her awareness. She left her home office computer, powered on with a financial dashboard open, then stepped outside for what she told Sarah was a short walk around the neighborhood. In reality, she stayed close enough to observe. Less than 10 minutes later, Daniel entered the office. He did not hesitate. He did not look around to check if anyone was watching. He simply sat down and began interacting with the system on the screen. From the distance of her parked car, Eleanor could not see every detail, but she did not need to. His familiarity with the interface told her enough. When he finally left the room, he closed the door behind him with the same casual rhythm he always used, as if nothing significant had occurred. Eleanor did not move immediately. She stayed where she was, watching the front door of her house, letting the information settle into place. That was the moment she understood the depth of what she was dealing with. This was not accidental access. It was practiced behavior. Later that afternoon, she reviewed her security logs again. There were multiple entries she had not focused on before, each one showing repeated access attempts from devices she did not fully recognize. Some were blocked, others partially succeeded, but all followed a consistent pattern of timing. Late evenings, early mornings, moments when the household was quiet and attention was low. She began writing everything into a second notebook, this one kept in a place only she knew. Each page represented a timeline that was becoming more precise with every entry. Meanwhile, life at home continued with its carefully constructed normalcy. Sarah often spoke about budgeting improvements, credit awareness, and shared financial responsibility, ideas that Daniel reinforced with calm agreement. He would occasionally make remarks about how modern households needed better financial discipline systems, framing it as general advice rather than personal direction. But Eleanor had begun to recognize something deeper in the language itself. It was not random conversation. It was reinforcement. A repeated narrative that positioned her as a financial burden without ever stating it directly in a confrontational way. One evening, during dinner, Sarah casually mentioned that Daniel had helped her review household efficiency options online. She described it as helpful, even considerate. Daniel smiled lightly, adding that it was important for families to stay aligned financially to avoid unnecessary strain. The phrase landed differently for Eleanor this time, not as an opinion, but as a continuation of a pattern she had already documented. After dinner, while Sarah cleaned the kitchen and Daniel stepped outside to take a phone call, Eleanor quietly checked her credit monitoring alerts again. Another inquiry had appeared. This one was more advanced than before. It suggested that someone had been evaluating not just credit capacity, but potential restructuring options tied to her identity. The language was subtle, technical, but unmistakably intentional. Eleanor closed the screen and sat still for a moment, listening to the quiet sounds of the house around her. Water running in the sink, a distant television in another room, the soft opening and closing of a door outside as Daniel returned from his call. Everything appeared ordinary. But beneath that surface, she could now clearly see a second layer of activity that was not visible to anyone else in the household. That night, she changed another set of security credentials. This time, she went further. She removed all secondary access permissions that had ever been shared, revoked every trusted device except her primary phone, and added a new verification step that required manual confirmation for every transaction attempt. She did not announce any of these changes. She did not explain them. She simply implemented them as quietly as she had observed everything else. The next morning, Daniel's behavior changed slightly, though not in a way that would have alarmed anyone who was not paying attention closely. He asked a casual question about whether any banking features had been updated recently, phrased as general curiosity. Eleanor responded calmly, saying she preferred simpler personal control over financial systems. Daniel nodded, but his expression held for a fraction longer than usual before he moved on. That small pause told her more than the question itself. It indicated recognition, awareness that something had shifted in the system he had been interacting with. Over the following days, the pattern of attempts changed again. Instead of direct access, there were now indirect probes. Notifications about password recovery attempts that never fully completed. Security prompts triggered at unusual hours. Each event was small on its own, but together they formed a consistent behavior pattern that suggested testing rather than execution. Eleanor did not react emotionally. She simply recorded everything. At the same time, she began preparing something else. She contacted her bank again, this time requesting a detailed audit log of all access activity over the past several months. She did not mention Daniel. She did not accuse anyone. She framed it as a personal review of account security history. The request was approved, and within a few days, she received a comprehensive report. As she reviewed it, the structure became undeniable. The access points, the timing, the repeated interactions with her account, all converged into a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence or error. She placed the report beside her notebook and studied both together. One was data, the other was observation. Together, they formed a complete picture of what had been happening under the surface of her daily life. From the living room, she could hear Daniel and Sarah talking softly, discussing weekend plans, unaware that the foundation of their financial structure was now fully visible to her. Eleanor closed both documents slowly and sat back in her chair. She was no longer trying to understand what was happening. She now understood it completely. The only thing left was timing. And somewhere in that quiet understanding, she knew the next step would not be about discovery anymore. It would be about what she chose to do with everything she now held in her hands, because what had been building in silence was approaching a point where it could no longer remain hidden. The moment Eleanor Whitmore confirmed the full structure of what had been happening, something inside her shifted from observation to preparation. She no longer spent her time wondering if the pattern was real, because now she had evidence that could not be dismissed. Instead, she began focusing on timing, consequences, and control over what would happen next inside her own home. Daniel Carter continued to move through the house with the same calm confidence as before, speaking casually about financial discipline and household responsibility, while Sarah Whitmore Carter remained aligned with his perspective, often repeating his ideas without questioning them. To anyone outside the situation, it would have appeared like a stable family adjusting to modern financial awareness. But inside Eleanor's mind, the structure had already changed completely. She began her preparation in silence. Every financial document she had collected was organized into a clear timeline, cross-referenced with access logs and behavioral notes. She no longer wrote down observations randomly. She arranged them like a system designed to show cause and effect. Each entry had a purpose, each date had a meaning, and each interaction pointed toward a consistent pattern of unauthorized access attempts that had taken place over months. One morning, she made a decision that marked the beginning of the final phase of her control. She contacted her bank again, but this time her request was not passive. She asked for a full security lockdown review, including a full reset of all authorization pathways, historical device mapping, and removal of any lingering access permissions that had been previously overlooked. She did not mention Daniel by name. She did not accuse anyone. She simply described the need for a complete personal security restructuring. The bank representative confirmed that the process would take several days, and Eleanor agreed without hesitation. During that time, she continued acting as though nothing had changed. She still cooked meals. She still participated in family conversations. She still listened to Daniel's explanations about budgeting strategies as if they carried the same neutral meaning they once did. But now every interaction was filtered through a different understanding. She was no longer reacting emotionally. She was measuring. Daniel, meanwhile, began to subtly increase his interest in financial discussions. He would ask more frequent questions about account features, security updates, and general banking behavior. His tone remained casual, but the frequency of his curiosity had increased. Sarah often joined these conversations, reinforcing the idea that modern financial systems required shared awareness and cooperation. Eleanor would respond politely, but she began to reduce the amount of information she shared. Instead of discussing details, she kept her answers general and nonspecific. A few days later, the bank completed the first stage of her security restructuring. Every device previously linked to her account had been removed. Every trusted session had been reset. New verification requirements were enforced that required direct confirmation through her personal phone, which she kept with her at all times. She did not inform Daniel or Sarah about the full extent of these changes. She simply allowed the system to exist quietly in the background, observing how the environment would respond. The response came sooner than expected. One evening, a notification appeared indicating multiple failed attempts to initiate account recovery procedures. The attempts were not successful, but they were persistent enough to indicate repeated effort. Eleanor did not react outwardly. She simply opened her notebook and recorded the time. Daniel was in the living room at that moment, sitting beside Sarah, discussing what he called long-term financial organization planning. His voice was calm, controlled, and confident. But Eleanor now noticed something different beneath that confidence. There was a subtle shift in his focus whenever financial access was mentioned, as if he was no longer simply advising, but evaluating. That night, after everyone had gone to their rooms, Eleanor reviewed the final report from the bank again. The full access history now showed a clear sequence of attempts that aligned with periods when Daniel had the highest level of proximity to her devices. The pattern was no longer abstract. It was structured, consistent, and traceable. She closed the report and placed it beside her notebook. At that moment, she understood that the situation had reached its final stage of clarity. There was nothing left to discover. Only action remained. The next morning, she made a quiet adjustment in her daily routine. She began keeping her phone with her at all times, even when moving within her own home. She also began limiting her physical distance from shared devices, ensuring that no external access point was ever left unattended. Daniel noticed the change within days. He asked a few indirect questions about whether she was experiencing issues with her devices or accounts. Eleanor responded calmly, stating that she preferred maintaining personal control over all financial systems. Daniel nodded, but his expression tightened slightly, almost imperceptibly, before he returned to normal conversation. That small reaction confirmed what she already suspected. He recognized the shift in control. Not fully, not clearly, but enough to sense that something had changed in his ability to interact with her financial environment. Over the following days, the household atmosphere remained outwardly unchanged, but internally the structure had shifted. Daniel's questions became more precise. His interest in banking systems became more technical. He began discussing hypothetical scenarios involving account restrictions, identity verification delays, and system recovery procedures. Each question was framed as general curiosity, but together they formed a pattern of increasing pressure to understand the new limitations that had been placed on access. Eleanor did not resist the conversations. She allowed them to happen, but she revealed nothing. Instead, she observed how Daniel adjusted his approach, as if recalibrating his understanding of what was still possible. One afternoon, she received a final notification from her bank. It confirmed that all historical unauthorized access attempts had been logged, reviewed, and permanently blocked under the updated security framework. The report also indicated that no further recovery attempts had succeeded since the restructuring. Eleanor read the message twice, then closed it. She did not feel surprise. She felt confirmation. That evening, she sat alone at the kitchen table while Daniel and Sarah were upstairs. The house was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of appliances and distant movement. She opened her notebook and reviewed everything one last time. Every pattern, every attempt, every behavioral shift. It all led to the same conclusion. The system had been exposed, not through confrontation, but through observation and timing. And now, with the system fully locked, the only remaining variable was what Daniel would do when he realized that the access he had relied on no longer existed in the way he expected. Eleanor closed the notebook slowly and placed it in the drawer. She turned off the kitchen light and stood in the darkness for a moment, listening to the silence of the house. Everything appeared normal on the surface, but underneath that stillness, the final stage of the situation had already begun, and the outcome would depend entirely on the next move made by the person who believed he still had control. The first real sign that Daniel Carter understood something had changed came on a rainy Thursday evening when the atmosphere inside the house felt heavier than usual. Eleanor Whitmore noticed it immediately, not because he said anything directly, but because of how carefully he began choosing his words. During dinner, he brought up financial security again, this time framing the conversation around how older banking systems sometimes overreact to harmless login attempts. Sarah Whitmore Carter nodded along, agreeing that modern fraud protections could create unnecessary stress for families trying to manage shared responsibilities. Eleanor listened quietly while stirring her tea, her expression calm and unreadable. She no longer reacted emotionally to the conversations because she understood their purpose now. Daniel was searching for information without asking for it directly. He wanted to know what she knew. He wanted to know how much access still existed. But most importantly, he wanted to know whether she suspected him specifically. Eleanor gave him nothing. She responded with simple observations about preferring private financial management and avoiding shared account systems whenever possible. Daniel smiled politely at her answer, but there was tension behind the expression now, subtle but visible enough to someone paying close attention. The balance inside the house had shifted, and both of them could feel it even if Sarah could not. Later that night, Eleanor received another alert from her bank. This time, the activity was different. Instead of attempting direct access, someone had initiated a request to verify personal information connected to her financial identity. The process was incomplete and automatically blocked, but the nature of the request made Eleanor sit motionless for several seconds. This was no longer random testing. It suggested preparation for something larger. She opened her notebook immediately and compared the timestamp with the activity inside the house. Daniel had been alone downstairs for nearly 20 minutes while Sarah was upstairs on a video call with a coworker. Again, the overlap was too precise to dismiss. But what unsettled Eleanor most was not the attempt itself. It was the escalation. Whoever was behind the activity was adapting, adjusting strategy, searching for another path now that the direct routes had been closed. The following morning, Eleanor decided to make another quiet move. She scheduled a private meeting with her bank's fraud specialist at a branch 20 minutes away from her neighborhood. She did not tell Sarah or Daniel where she was going. She simply said she had errands to run. During the meeting, she presented the full timeline she had assembled over the previous weeks, including transaction records, access logs, failed recovery attempts, and identity verification probes. The specialist reviewed everything carefully before explaining that the pattern strongly suggested a gradual attempt to establish layered financial access over time. Eleanor listened without interrupting. She already knew what the answer would be before she arrived, but hearing it confirmed by someone outside the situation changed something internally. It removed the final traces of doubt that still lingered beneath her calm exterior. Before leaving the bank, she took one final precaution. She transferred the majority of her savings into a newly protected account structure that required in-person authorization for major changes. The process was secure, slow, and deliberately difficult to manipulate remotely. She wanted every future move connected to her finances to require her direct presence. As she drove home through the steady Ohio rain, she felt strangely calm for the first time in weeks. Not because the situation was resolved, but because control had returned fully into her hands. When she arrived home, Daniel was sitting at the kitchen table working on his laptop. He looked up immediately when she walked in, studying her expression for a fraction longer than normal. "Busy day?" he asked casually. Eleanor placed her keys on the counter and answered with the same steady tone she had maintained throughout the entire situation. "Just handling some personal account updates." Daniel nodded slowly, then returned to his screen, but Eleanor noticed his fingers stop moving on the keyboard for several seconds after her response. That evening, Sarah mentioned that Daniel had been stressed recently because of financial pressures related to his work. She described him as overwhelmed, but trying to stay responsible for the family. Eleanor listened carefully, recognizing another pattern she had seen before: narrative shaping, positioning himself as burdened, creating emotional context before future explanations became necessary. The realization made her uneasy in a different way now. This was not only about money anymore. It was about perception, about creating a version of reality where every suspicious action could later be explained as misunderstood responsibility. Over the next several days, Daniel became noticeably more attentive toward Eleanor. He offered to help with groceries, asked whether she needed assistance with technology, and brought up conversations about family trust more frequently than before. To Sarah, the behavior likely appeared caring, but to Eleanor, it felt strategic, almost as if he was testing whether emotional reassurance could reopen doors that security systems no longer allowed. Eleanor accepted the kindness, politely, while revealing nothing. Every interaction became another piece of information. Every sudden act of consideration arrived too late to feel genuine. Then came the moment that changed the entire situation again. One afternoon, while organizing documents in her home office, Eleanor found an envelope partially hidden beneath a stack of old insurance paperwork. At first glance it appeared ordinary, but the return address caught her attention immediately. It was connected to a lending institution she did not recognize. Slowly, she opened the envelope and began reading. Her hands remained steady, but the deeper she went into the document, the colder the room seemed to feel around her. The paperwork referenced a preliminary borrowing assessment connected to her identity profile. It was incomplete, not finalized, but detailed enough to confirm that someone had already begun exploring options far beyond monthly withdrawals. This was structured financial preparation tied directly to her personal information. Eleanor sat down quietly at her desk and reread every line. The timeline on the paperwork aligned almost perfectly with the period when Daniel had increased his discussions about household restructuring and financial efficiency. Suddenly, dozens of previous conversations sounded different in her memory, less like advice, more like groundwork. She closed the folder slowly and stared at the wall in silence. The situation was no longer confined to hidden transactions or unauthorized access attempts. This was something larger, more deliberate, and far more dangerous to her future stability if left unchecked. Downstairs, she could hear Daniel laughing softly with Sarah in the kitchen, their voices blending into the ordinary sounds of domestic life. But now Eleanor understood something with complete clarity. The version of Daniel presented inside the household and the version operating quietly beneath the surface were no longer the same person in her mind. One was carefully constructed for trust. The other was built around access, influence, and control. And for the first time since this began, Eleanor realized that the next phase would not simply involve protecting herself from what had already happened. It would involve preparing for what Daniel still intended to do next. After discovering the lending assessment documents tied to her identity, Eleanor Whitmore stopped viewing the situation as a private family issue and began seeing it as something much more calculated. The monthly withdrawals had been only the beginning. What frightened her now was the realization that Daniel Carter had likely been building toward a larger financial move for months, slowly testing boundaries, observing weaknesses, and shaping the household atmosphere in ways that kept suspicion away from him. Yet despite everything she had uncovered, Eleanor still chose silence. Not because she was afraid to confront him, but because she understood something important now. The moment Daniel realized she fully understood what he had been doing, his behavior would change completely. As long as he believed she remained uncertain, she still had the advantage of observation. Over the following week, Eleanor adjusted her routine again. She became more deliberate in the way she interacted with both Daniel and Sarah Whitmore Carter. She listened more than she spoke. She paid attention to every financial conversation, every passing comment, every attempt Daniel made to steer discussions toward money, debt, or long-term planning. And the more she listened, the clearer the pattern became. Daniel was slowly preparing Sarah emotionally for a future situation that had not happened yet. He frequently spoke about how difficult modern finances had become, how families sometimes needed creative restructuring, and how older generations often struggled to understand current economic realities. Sarah rarely challenged him. Instead, she seemed to absorb his perspective naturally, repeating parts of his reasoning during conversations without realizing how much influence he had gained over the household narrative. One evening during dinner, Daniel casually brought up the topic of home equity loans. His tone remained relaxed, almost educational, as he explained how many families used property leverage to unlock financial flexibility. Eleanor kept her expression, neutral while listening, but internally she felt every piece locking together. The lending paperwork she had discovered suddenly carried a different weight. This was no longer theoretical discussion. It was preparation. Daniel was not merely experimenting with financial access anymore. He was building a framework that could eventually place major assets under pressure without raising immediate alarm. That night, Eleanor returned to her office and reviewed the documents again. She noticed something she had overlooked before. One section of the paperwork referenced projected approval thresholds based on combined household influence and residential stability indicators. The wording was technical, but its meaning was clear enough. Whoever initiated the process had been presenting the household as financially interconnected. Eleanor sat quietly at her desk for a long moment, realizing the true danger was not simply unauthorized money transfers. It was gradual integration, the slow blending of financial systems, authority, and trust until separation became difficult to untangle. The next morning, Eleanor made another decision. She contacted an attorney specializing in financial protection and identity misuse. She scheduled the consultation privately under the pretense of updating estate planning documents. During the meeting, she explained the situation carefully without making emotional accusations. She presented the access logs, the suspicious lending inquiries, and the timeline she had documented over months. The attorney listened closely before advising her to secure every legal and financial boundary immediately while avoiding premature confrontation until all protections were fully established. Eleanor appreciated the calm professionalism of the advice. It matched the strategy she had already been building internally. Quiet action, controlled timing, no emotional explosions. Before leaving the office, she updated multiple legal protections connected to her accounts, property records, and financial authorizations. Every change required direct verification through her personal identification moving forward. As she drove home, she realized something else for the first time. Daniel may not even fully understand how much evidence she had already gathered. That thought shifted the balance even further in her favor. When she returned home that afternoon, she found Daniel helping Sarah organize paperwork at the kitchen table. Mortgage information, utility statements, and budgeting spreadsheets were spread across the surface. Daniel smiled when Eleanor entered the room and explained that they were trying to make the household finances more efficient. Eleanor nodded politely and walked past them without comment, but inside she recognized another layer of positioning. Daniel was normalizing deeper financial integration inside the home, making increasingly complex money discussions feel routine rather than alarming. Over the next several days, Eleanor noticed Daniel becoming slightly more impatient beneath his controlled exterior. He asked more direct questions about her banking preferences, whether she planned to refinance anything, and whether she had considered consolidating accounts for simpler management. Each question arrived wrapped in concern or practicality, but the consistency revealed intent. Eleanor responded with calm vagueness every time. She neither agreed nor argued. She simply allowed him to continue believing that she remained unaware of the full picture. Then came the moment that confirmed her suspicions beyond any remaining doubt. Late one evening, Eleanor woke unexpectedly after hearing movement downstairs. The house was dark and quiet except for the faint glow coming from the kitchen area. She stayed silent at the top of the staircase and listened carefully. Daniel's voice drifted upward in a low whisper as he spoke on the phone. She could not hear every word clearly, but certain phrases reached her with chilling precision. It should have been approved already. The information matches. I just need more time. Eleanor remained completely still. Her pulse slowed instead of rising. The fear she might have felt weeks earlier had transformed into clarity now. Daniel was not improvising anymore. He was actively pursuing something larger behind the scenes, and delays were beginning to frustrate him. A few moments later, she heard him end the call and walked back toward the guest room. Eleanor quietly returned to her bedroom without making a sound. The next morning at breakfast, Daniel acted perfectly normal. He discussed weather forecasts, work schedules, and grocery lists with the same relaxed tone he always used. Sarah remained cheerful and unaware. But Eleanor now understood something with complete certainty. The situation had reached a stage where Daniel was no longer simply testing access or gathering information. He was waiting for an outcome, some kind of approval, some kind of financial event tied directly to the systems he had been quietly building around her identity and assets. That realization changed Eleanor's priorities immediately. Protecting herself was no longer enough. She needed to understand exactly how far Daniel had already gone before he realized the systems beneath him had been silently locked down weeks earlier. And somewhere beneath the calm routine of breakfast conversations and ordinary suburban life, a hidden countdown had already begun ticking toward a confrontation that only one person in the house knew was coming. After hearing Daniel Carter's late-night phone conversation, Eleanor Whitmore no longer questioned whether a larger financial operation was unfolding around her. The only uncertainty left was how close Daniel believed he was to succeeding. Over the next several days, she became even more disciplined in her silence. She maintained her routines exactly as before, speaking calmly during meals, asking Sarah Whitmore Carter ordinary questions about work and daily life, and never once allowing her growing awareness to surface emotionally. But internally, she had entered a completely different phase. She was no longer observing for confirmation. She was observing for timing. Daniel, meanwhile, appeared increasingly focused beneath his polished exterior. He spent longer periods working on his laptop in shared areas of the house, often surrounded by paperwork that involved budgeting projections, lending estimates, and household financial planning. Sarah seemed proud of how organized he had become, frequently mentioning how helpful he was in managing future plans. Eleanor listened quietly every time, recognizing how deeply Daniel had embedded himself into the family's financial identity. He had not forced control aggressively. He had built it gradually through trust, routine, and repetition until his involvement felt normal instead of intrusive. One afternoon, while Sarah was out meeting a friend for coffee, Daniel approached Eleanor in the kitchen with an unusually careful tone. He asked whether she had ever considered restructuring the ownership of certain household assets to simplify inheritance and taxes later on. Eleanor looked at him calmly while pouring tea, allowing several seconds of silence before responding. "I prefer to keep things exactly where they are," she said evenly. Daniel smiled politely, but Eleanor noticed the tension in his jaw before he looked away. The answer disappointed him more than he expected. That small reaction confirmed another piece of the structure she had been mapping for weeks. The pressure was increasing because his timeline was advancing faster than his access. Later that evening, Eleanor reviewed additional documents she had quietly gathered from public property and financial records connected to her own accounts. What she discovered made the situation feel even more deliberate. Multiple soft credit inquiries had been initiated over the previous months, all timed closely with periods when Daniel had increased discussions about refinancing, equity, or long-term household planning. None of the inquiries alone would have triggered immediate alarm for most people, but together they revealed a clear progression. First access, then observation, then integration, then borrowing preparation. Eleanor sat in silence for a long time after realizing how methodical the sequence truly was. This had not been impulsive greed. It had been strategy. The next morning, she took another step quietly behind the scenes. She met with her attorney again and expanded the legal protections around her estate and property ownership. Additional restrictions were placed on any future transfer, refinance request, or financial restructuring connected to her identity. Every change required direct in-person verification with multiple forms of identification. The attorney also recommended placing alerts on all major financial reporting systems to detect any future lending attempts immediately. Eleanor approved everything without hesitation. By the time she returned home, she understood that the invisible walls around her finances were now stronger than Daniel realized. But she also understood something equally important. Once his plans began failing repeatedly, he would eventually start looking for the reason. That realization made timing critical. During the following week, the atmosphere inside the house subtly shifted. Daniel remained outwardly polite, but moments of frustration began slipping through his carefully controlled demeanor. He became quieter during conversations about money, more distracted, occasionally irritated by small inconveniences that previously would not have affected him. Sarah noticed the change too, though she interpreted it differently. She told Eleanor that Daniel was simply under pressure because financial systems are getting stricter these days. The irony of the statement almost made Eleanor pause. Daniel had spent months shaping the household narrative so effectively that even his growing frustration was now being explained in ways that protected him. One evening after dinner, Eleanor walked past the guest room and noticed the door slightly open. Daniel was inside speaking quietly on another phone call. She did not stop completely, but she slowed enough to hear fragments of the conversation. The verification keeps failing. No, the information is correct. I do not understand why it suddenly changed. Eleanor continued walking without making a sound, but internally every piece clicked together instantly. The security measures she had implemented weeks earlier were disrupting whatever process Daniel had already put into motion. And for the first time since this began, she realized he was no longer operating confidently. He was confused. That confusion became more visible over the next few days. Daniel began checking his phone constantly. He spent late nights on his laptop again, sometimes staying awake. Past midnight reviewing documents at the dining table. His questions toward Eleanor also changed. They became less theoretical and more probing. He casually asked whether she had changed banks recently, whether she had updated account information, whether any institutions had contacted her about routine verification processes. Eleanor answered each question with calm simplicity while revealing absolutely nothing. The less she explained, the more uncertain Daniel seemed to become. Then came the moment Eleanor had quietly anticipated for weeks. Early one Saturday morning, she received an urgent fraud alert from her bank. A major lending application connected to her identity had been automatically blocked after failing enhanced verification protocols. The application amount was far larger than anything previously attempted. Eleanor stared at the notification in complete silence as the final layer of Daniel's plan revealed itself fully. He had not only been preparing small financial access systems. He had attempted to leverage her identity for a substantial loan operation tied directly to her assets and financial profile. What stunned Eleanor most was not the amount itself. It was the confidence behind the attempt. Daniel had clearly believed the structure he built around her information was stable enough to support something that large. She locked her phone slowly and looked out the kitchen window at the quiet suburban street outside. The morning looked peaceful, ordinary. Yet inside the house, a hidden financial war had just reached its breaking point. A few minutes later, Daniel entered the kitchen carrying a coffee mug. The moment he saw Eleanor sitting there, he paused almost imperceptibly. His face remained calm, but his eyes carried something new now. Uncertainty. Eleanor met his gaze with the same composed expression she had maintained from the beginning. Neither of them mentioned the failed application. Neither acknowledged the invisible collision that had just taken place behind the scenes. But in that silence, Both understood something had changed permanently. Daniel no longer had invisible control over the systems surrounding her life. And Eleanor no longer needed proof of what he had intended to do. The only thing remaining now was deciding how and when the truth would finally surface inside a family that still believed everything was normal. After the failed lending application was blocked, the atmosphere inside the house changed in a way only Eleanor Whitmore and Daniel Carter could fully feel. Nothing dramatic happened on the surface. Meals were still shared. Conversations still sounded normal. Sarah Whitmore Carter continued believing the household was simply navigating ordinary financial stress. But underneath that calm suburban routine, the balance of control had completely shifted. Daniel knew something had gone wrong. Eleanor knew exactly what had gone wrong, and neither of them spoke about it directly. Over the next several days, Daniel became noticeably more careful. His questions about finances almost disappeared, replaced by a quieter, more observant version of himself. He spent longer periods isolated in the guest room with his laptop, emerging only for meals or short conversations with Sarah. To anyone else, it might have looked like work-related stress, but Eleanor recognized the behavior for what it truly was. He was reassessing, trying to understand which part of his system had failed and whether the damage could still be contained before exposure reached Sarah or outside authorities. Eleanor, meanwhile, continued her strategy of silence. She no longer needed additional evidence. She already possessed enough documentation to prove patterns of unauthorized access, financial manipulation attempts, and identity-based lending activity tied directly to her accounts. But she understood something critical now. The greatest advantage she still held was that Daniel did not know how much she already knew. As long as he remained uncertain, he would continue revealing himself through his reactions. One afternoon, while Sarah was visiting coworkers downtown, Daniel approached Eleanor in the living room with a carefully controlled expression. He sat across from her and began speaking in a tone that sounded almost rehearsed. He explained that financial institutions had become overly aggressive recently, and that innocent people often became trapped in complicated verification systems by mistake. Eleanor listened calmly without interrupting. Daniel continued, suggesting that families needed to work together during financial misunderstandings instead of overreacting. Every sentence felt indirect, as though he was trying to introduce explanations before accusations ever surfaced. Eleanor noticed the strategy immediately. He was planting emotional defenses in advance, quietly shaping a narrative where future discoveries could be reframed as confusion rather than intent. When he finished speaking, Eleanor simply nodded once and replied softly. Transparency usually prevents misunderstandings. The sentence hung in the air longer than either of them expected. Daniel's expression remained controlled, but Eleanor saw something shift behind his eyes for a brief moment. For the first time since this began, he looked uncertain not just about the financial systems, but about her personally. Later that evening, Eleanor reviewed her notebooks one final time. Every transaction, every failed login, every lending inquiry, every conversation about home equity and household restructuring. The pattern was complete. But one detail continued bothering her more than the others. Daniel had acted with too much confidence for too long. That level of certainty suggested he believed he had protections somewhere beyond simple access to her accounts. Eleanor decided she needed to understand exactly how far his preparations extended before making any move. The next morning, she quietly contacted the fraud specialist at her bank again and requested a deeper investigation into all recent lending-related activity connected to her identity. A few hours later, she received a call that changed the situation completely. The specialist explained that there had been multiple layered attempts to establish financial credibility profiles connected to her assets over several months. Some applications were incomplete, others were exploratory, but one detail stood out above everything else. A secondary contact number had repeatedly appeared across the inquiries. It did not belong to Eleanor. It belonged to Daniel. Eleanor sat motionless after hearing the information. Until that moment, much of what she uncovered relied on patterns, timing, and circumstantial overlap. But now there was direct connective evidence tying Daniel personally to the lending activity. The quiet tension that had filled the house for weeks suddenly became sharper inside her mind. Daniel had not simply manipulated access behind the scenes. He had attached himself directly to systems using her identity while positioning himself as a trusted financial guide inside the family. That evening, Sarah excitedly announced that Daniel had been researching future investment opportunities to help stabilize everyone financially. Eleanor listened quietly while watching Daniel's reaction. He smiled modestly, playing the role he had perfected for months. Responsible, strategic, helpful. But now Eleanor could see the performance clearly. Every conversation about financial security had actually been part of a larger architecture designed to normalize his authority over money inside the household. The realization no longer made her angry. It made her coldly focused. Over the next several days, Eleanor began preparing for the final stage carefully and methodically. She created copies of every document and stored them outside the house. She organized timelines, account records, communication logs, and fraud reports into clearly labeled files. She also updated her attorney on every new discovery, including the lending applications tied to Daniel's phone number. The attorney advised her to avoid confrontation until everything was fully secured legally and financially. Eleanor agreed. Timing remained the most important factor. Then came the moment that confirmed Daniel was beginning to panic internally. Late one night, Eleanor woke again to movement downstairs. This time she heard cabinet doors opening and closing softly in the home office area. Remaining silent, she moved carefully toward the hallway and looked down the staircase. Daniel was standing beside her desk, searching through paperwork with visible frustration. Not calm curiosity, frustration. He checked drawers, opened folders, then stopped suddenly. When he heard a floorboard shift above him, Eleanor stepped back into the darkness before he could look up fully. A few moments later, she heard him close everything and return quietly to the guest room. Back in her bedroom, Eleanor sat awake for hours replaying the scene in her mind. Daniel was searching because something critical was no longer accessible. The systems he built were collapsing around him, and now he was trying to determine how much evidence existed outside his control. The following morning, his behavior became almost unnaturally polite. He offered to make breakfast, asked Eleanor if she needed help with errands, complimented the house repeatedly during conversation with Sarah. The sudden warmth felt artificial now that Eleanor understood the fear beneath it. Daniel was trying to stabilize the emotional environment because the financial structure underneath it was failing rapidly. But what Daniel still did not realize was that Eleanor had already moved beyond simply protecting herself. Quietly, patiently, and without ever raising her voice, she had spent weeks preparing something far more dangerous to him than confrontation. She had prepared proof. And soon, the carefully managed version of reality he built inside the household would no longer survive contact with the truth waiting silently inside her files. The final shift inside the house began quietly on a cold Monday morning in late November. Eleanor Whitmore woke before sunrise, made coffee in complete silence, and sat alone at the kitchen table staring at the organized stack of folders beside her. Every document was arranged precisely. Transaction histories, lending inquiries, failed verification attempts, fraud reports, device access logs, attorney correspondence. Months earlier, she had been confused by small withdrawals she barely understood. Now she possessed a complete map of a hidden financial structure that had slowly formed around her identity without her consent. Upstairs, she could hear faint movement as Daniel Carter and Sarah Whitmore Carter began waking up for the day. The sounds felt strangely ordinary considering what Eleanor now knew. For weeks, she had maintained the appearance of calm while quietly protecting every part of her financial life. But this morning was different. This morning she had already decided the silence would end. Daniel entered the kitchen first, dressed neatly for work, carrying the same controlled confidence he always presented to the world. But Eleanor noticed something immediately. He looked exhausted. The careful polish in his appearance could no longer fully hide the tension underneath. His eyes moved briefly toward the folders on the table before returning to his coffee mug. "Big plans today?" he asked casually. Eleanor looked at him for several seconds before answering. "Actually, yes. Nothing more. Just those two words." But Daniel's posture changed almost imperceptibly after hearing them. Sarah joined them moments later, cheerful and unaware, talking about holiday plans and work schedules while the invisible tension at the table thickened beneath every ordinary sentence. Eleanor listened quietly until breakfast ended. Then she asked both of them to stay for a few minutes because there were important household matters she wanted to discuss. Sarah agreed immediately, though confusion crossed her face when she noticed Eleanor's unusually formal tone. Daniel remained silent, but slowly sat back down at the table. Eleanor folded her hands carefully before speaking. Over the past several months, she began calmly, someone has been accessing my financial accounts without my authorization. Sarah blinked in shock almost immediately, but Daniel did not move. His face remained controlled, though the color drained slightly from his expression. Eleanor continued before either of them could interrupt. She explained the small withdrawals first, then the login attempts, then the lending inquiries tied to her identity. Every sentence was delivered with calm precision, supported by documents she quietly slid across the table one at a time. Sarah's confusion slowly transformed into disbelief as she reviewed the paperwork. Daniel finally spoke, attempting to position the situation as a misunderstanding caused by shared household systems and financial confusion. But Eleanor was already prepared for that. Response. She opened another folder and revealed the fraud investigation records, including the lending applications connected directly to Daniel's phone number and contact information. The room fell completely silent after that. Sarah looked at Daniel with visible shock, waiting for an explanation that never arrived. Daniel attempted to speak again, this time less confidently, suggesting that he had only been trying to help stabilize future finances. But the explanation collapsed under the weight of the evidence already sitting on the table. Eleanor remained calm throughout the entire conversation. She never raised her voice. She never insulted him. That calmness unsettled Daniel more than anger ever could have, because by now he understood something clearly. This was not emotional suspicion anymore. It was documented reality. Sarah began crying quietly as the truth unfolded piece by piece in front of her. She kept asking Daniel why he never told her any of this, why he used Eleanor's information, why lending systems connected back to him personally. Daniel struggled to answer directly because every explanation created another contradiction. The carefully managed narrative he spent months building inside the household was collapsing faster than he could control it. Finally, Eleanor reached for the final folder sitting at the bottom of the stack. Unlike the others, this one contained legal paperwork prepared quietly with her attorney over the previous weeks. She placed it in front of Daniel without emotion. Everything connected to my accounts, property, and identity has already been secured, she said evenly. Every institution involved has been notified. Every access point has been removed, and every future attempt will trigger automatic investigation procedures. Daniel stared at the documents silently. For the first time since Eleanor discovered the withdrawals months earlier, he looked genuinely afraid. Not angry, not defensive, afraid. Because he finally realized the systems he believed he controlled had already been dismantled long before he noticed anything changing. Sarah looked between them in stunned silence, struggling to process how deeply the deception extended. Eleanor turned toward her daughter gently and explained that she had delayed this confrontation intentionally until every legal and financial protection was fully secured. She told Sarah she did not want chaos, emotional explosions, or public humiliation. She simply wanted the truth documented clearly before anyone had the opportunity to distort it further. Daniel remained silent for several long seconds before finally asking the question Eleanor had anticipated for weeks. How long have you known? Eleanor met his eyes calmly. Long enough to let you keep revealing yourself. The sentence landed harder than any accusation she could have made, because in that moment Daniel understood the full reality of what happened. Every failed attempt, every blocked verification, every missing access point, every quiet change inside the system. Eleanor had seen it all unfolding while saying nothing. The control he thought he possessed had disappeared weeks ago without him realizing it. Sarah quietly left the kitchen in tears shortly afterward, overwhelmed by the collapse of the reality she believed she was living inside. Daniel remained seated at the table, staring at the paperwork as if trying to find some path backward through the damage already done. But there was none left. Eleanor slowly gathered the folders together and stood up from the table. Before leaving the room, she paused briefly beside him and spoke in the same calm voice she had maintained from the very beginning. You spent months believing I was too old, too trusting, and too distracted to notice what was happening around me, she said softly. What you never understood is that silence does not mean weakness. Then she walked out of the kitchen, leaving Daniel alone with the evidence, the collapsed structure he built around her identity, and the realization that the quiet woman he underestimated had already ended the game long before he realized he was losing it.